Satish, I might just need you to unmute. Sorry, just mute yourself during the welcome remarks, if that's okay.
copies of that are outside, so I encourage you to pick one up, and I'll be very happy to talk with you more about these very crucial issues for all of us and for many thousands of people around the region. But with that said, I would like, I'm very pleased that our Crawford School directors joined us this morning, and I'd like to ask Professor Fiona Yap to come to the podium and to open our workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for that delightful introduction. I'd like to kick off the ceremonies today by acknowledging and celebrating the traditional owners of the land on whose lands we meet, and pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Distinguished guests, friends, speakers, and colleagues. As Interim Director of the Crawford School and on behalf of the Australian National University, welcome to the Pacific Migration Research Workshop 2021. We are particularly delighted today to have with us several honored guests and distinguished dignitaries whom I would like to acknowledge. And they are Robert Cicillo, the High Commissioner of the Solomon Islands High Commission, and Curtis Tuihalangyanye, Deputy Head of Mission, High Commission of the Kingdom of Tonga. And please forgive me if I had somehow mangled all that. A very warm welcome in person to all of you. Now, today's workshop is significant in a number of ways. It is a milestone in the post-COVID-19 era for us, especially to gather and meet in person, as well as through a number of other resources, which we see going on here, the activities. We know that the presentations today at this workshop are important. They cut across research, policy, and advocacy. The works are multidisciplinary, and we know it's important because it's the first time in a long while that I've been reminded to keep my remarks short. So thank you all for actually being here to help us meet that milestone. I want to keep my remarks brief. I think people are already doing that. So let me say briefly that the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU is delighted to host this workshop. As the National University of Australia, the ANU pursues a strategic vision to advance knowledge through research and education. Now, many of you here, in person or online, are associated with the university. You have siblings, families, children, yourselves may have had multiple degrees out of this university. And I think it pays to acknowledge that in this post-COVID-19 era, where we are looking at very constrained environments for the universities, it is worthwhile to remember that the ANU, as with many universities, is committed to keeping research, education, and policy analysis vital. We want to point out that it is not just serendipitous that you are meeting here at the Crawford School in the ANU. The Crawford School has had a long, decades-long, distinguished and committed effort to pursue these ANU strategic priorities through its 4 departments and 21 centers. And of course, one of the 21 centers is the Development Policy Center, which is also organizing this workshop. We are at Crawford School invested in working with our key stakeholders in the Australian public service, in industry, in non-government sectors, and with foreign governments, with a particular focus on Asia and the Pacific. We have used decades of strong experience working with these key stakeholders to craft development policy in Australia and the region. Today's workshop adds yet another valuable contribution to CROFIT's long-standing pursuit of excellence in policy analysis and policy relevant research and education. Now, let me take this opportunity, of course, to thank the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, an important partner in this pursuit, for funding this workshop, as well as the Pacific labor migration that has motivated the work that you are all doing today. We are grateful not only to DFAT funding, which makes this research possible, but also to CROFIT's long-standing partnerships with the Department of with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade across a number of areas of research on Asia and the Pacific. Now, today's workshop is led by Professor Stephen House and the Development Policy Center. It brings together researchers, public servants, NGOs, and of course, students to better understand migration trends in the Pacific. Now, Development Policy Center is a think tank for aid and development that serves Australia, the region, and the global development community. Professor House and the team of researchers at the Development Policy Center undertake independent research and promote practical initiatives to improve the effectiveness of Australian aid to support the development of Papua New Guinea and the Pacific Island region, and to contribute to the better global development policy. This collaborative program brings together governments, university experts, and highly skilled practitioners. Of course, we know that the workshop builds on an annual update, which has been happening since 2012. Now, with the COVID-19 lockdowns, this labor mobility discussion has gone online for monthly meetings. But today, we are glad to see it crystallize into a one-day workshop, which will discuss medium and long-term effects to labor mobility and participation, including Pacific Islanders' participation in and access to temporary and permanent migration programs and its social and economic impacts. There will be works on employment, remittances, economic mobility, and well-being of Pacific Islanders in Australia and New Zealand. And there will be, of course, work on regional labor markets, particularly horticulture, viticulture, and agriculture in Australia and New Zealand. I don't think one day is going to cut it. So thank you all and welcome. I now have the singular pleasure to turn the floor to Associate Professor Julianbara, who is head of the ANU's Department of Pacific Affairs and Deputy Team Leader of the DFAT-funded Pacific Research Program. Now, Professor Julianbara will introduce the Pacific Research Program and ANU's broader role in the Pacific research. Julian.
Hi, everyone, and I'll keep it very brief. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. I'm here to say a few words about the Pacific Research Program, which Fiona has mentioned. It's a 5-year research and education partnership with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and ANU. It's delivered by a consortium here at the ANU. It's the Development Policy Centre, my Department of Pacific Affairs and the Bell School and the Lowy Institute. And the idea of the Pacific Research Program is to support high quality, long-term policy focused research that can help make a difference in the region. One of the big objectives of the PRP is to really focus on issues that matter and to create a body of research evidence that can help constructive engagement of those issues. One of the benefits of the PRP is that it allows us to undertake long-term and really high quality research. And I think today's workshop is a really good example of that coming to fruition. Many of the speakers here today are bringing together very deep and long-term knowledge of the region and of this issue in particular. And so I'm sure it's going to lead to many more long-term constructive discussions around the policy issues involved in this space. One of the objectives of the PRP is to support research collaborations, both across Australia and between Australia and the region. And it's really pleasing to see the sort of breadth of the speakers today and the diverse collection of speakers that are bringing a range of experiences, including Pacific voices to this space. I note, and Fiona mentioned as well, that this is one of the first face-to-face events that we've seen in quite a while, so it's really pleasing. And I really hope that the dynamic that is opened by face-to-face events leads to really constructive and deep collaborations and conversations that will live on beyond this event. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've got to hand over now to Gabriella de Souza, who's the Chief Economist of the Committee for the Economic Development of Australia, who's chairing the next session. So thank you and enjoy the workshop.
Great, thank you for that introduction and the promotion. I'm Senior Economist my name is Gabriella de Souza and I'm Senior Economist at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to this session. I'm really delighted to be chair for this session on future labour demand and skills. I was hoping to make it to Canberra in person for this, but obviously I'm in Victoria at the moment and our state restrictions sadly do not allow for that, but really happy to be here all the same, chairing the session. We've got some excellent presentations today, so I won't take up too much of our allotted time. But just some quick housekeeping on how we're going to run this session. So each presenter will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. So please keep those handy. We're operating in a hybrid environment, so we'll be taking questions both via the Q&A section on the Zoom chat. And if you do have a question and you'd like to ask it on screen, you can raise your hand and we'll come to you. We're also going to be taking questions from the in-person audience at the Molonglo Theatre. And I believe there are a couple of roving mics there as well. Okay, without further ado, let's welcome our first speakers, Michael Clemens from the Centre for Global Development and Satish Chand from the University of New South Wales.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you if you can see these slides.
Yep, can see them.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to learning from all of you. It's great to be among so many experts and several old friends I'm seeing. This is joint work with Satish Chand, who's going to finish this presentation that I'm going to begin. And we are asking a very simple question. That is, could we construct a reasonable quantitative scenario, not a forecast, but a scenario for future demand for vocationally skilled workers in Australia and the potential for that demand to be supplied from the Pacific, pure labor market analysis. And when I say vocationally skilled labor, to be very clear, I just mean workers doing jobs that are classified by the Australian Bureau of Statistics as not requiring a bachelor's degree. They are what some people call low-skill workers. We don't, because they are workers who often have extensive skill, often required on the job, often very specialized. We don't consider them to be low-skilled. We just refer to them as vocational skill. And that's not a common term. I don't mean it to be confusing. But I'll be referring to high skill and vocational skill as requiring or not requiring a bachelor's degree. And that's all that it means. Now, if you ask many policymakers around the world, certainly in the United States where I'm sitting right now, and many in Europe, What is the relationship between vocationally skilled employment and economic for immigrants and economic growth? The answer is very simple, that in a pure economic sense, a highly educated immigrant would always be more desirable than a vocationally educated immigrant. Why? Because there is a very simple economic model in the head of that person, judging the marginal product of a worker according to the wage of that worker. And since more highly educated workers have categorically higher wages, they must in some sense be contributing more to the economy. That model assumes implicitly a perfect substitutability between these two types of workers that is not in evidence in any economy, and certainly not in the Australian economy. So if we relax that very strong assumption, how could we come towards more reasonable future scenarios? And to do that, I want to introduce three tools that I'll do as quickly as I can. One is some concept of technological change in the future. What would be a reasonable expectation for the substitutability between high skilled workers and vocationally skilled workers over the next few decades in the Australian economy? If we're going to relax this strong assumption of perfect substitution, we have to replace it with something and something quantitative. The second is a distinction between the supply of skills in the economy, the education that people have, and the tasks, the skill content of the tasks demanded by the economy, which are not the same thing, but often treated as such. And the third, we're going to introduce a distinction between two types of vocationally skilled workers, one that we'll call fundamental workers and one that we'll call replaceable, and in a specific sense that I'll explain. So let's start with how could we come to a quantitative idea of the substitutability between high skilled workers, here represented on the vertical axis, and vocationally skilled workers, here represented on the horizontal axis. And the most extreme, extreme assumption would be to assume no substitutability between these workers at all, what economists would call a Leontief production function. And just intuitively that they're like eggs and sugar in the making of cookies. If you're going to make twice as many decent cookies, you're going to need twice as many eggs and twice as much sugar in a fixed proportion, represented here by the blue line. An expanding economy, if you want to know if you know how many high-skill workers it's going to employ, and you want to know how many complementary low-skill workers, as often called, or we're calling them vocationally skilled workers, are going to be employed in that economy, you can just read it off the horizontal axis here, because those are going to evolve in a fixed proportion. That's a very strong assumption. The opposite, and it's really an extremely strong assumption, is that these are perfectly substitutable as production expands. So they're more like large and small eggs in the production of cookies. If you produce twice as many cookies, you don't need to use twice as many large eggs. You could replace them all with small eggs, and you'd get exactly the same cookies. And the production frontier looks more like this as the economy expands. It need not be the case that if you know how many higher skilled workers are going to be employed, that any fixed proportion of vocationally skilled workers are going to be employed. It could be less as the ratio of these workers shifts over time due to change in the technology of production. And in fact, if that ratio changes quite a lot, you could even see expansions of high skill employment accompanied by an absolute decline in vocationally skilled employment. So what is a reasonable expectation of the shift in this ratio over time? Well, what has been going on in the Australian economy? So here we're and in several graphs to come, we're going to look at the 1986, 1996, 2006, and 2016 censuses. And here is the one measure of the relative education that people have in the workforce. So this is some measure of the supply of skill. The vertical axis here is the number of people with vocational education, that is less than university education, for every worker who has a university education. And in the 1980s, that was about 10. And that's been collapsing. It's in more recent years, it's been closer to 2. But something is very different has been happening on the demand side of skill. And here I want to introduce this distinction between the supply of skills embodied in the education of a worker and the demand for tasks that embody certain skills. Here in the rows, you could think of levels of education, higher education on the bottom, vocational education on the top. And any worker with any degree of education could perform the basic tasks like being a welder, or more complex tasks like being a cinematographer. Australian Bureau of Statistics assigns these occupations to a skill level based on the preponderance of people with a certain education level in that occupation, and their assessment of the skill needs of that occupation, so that we can consider the skill content of tasks. And in the number of employed people in the Australian workforce, the trend of demand for skills embodied in tasks is quite different from education. Here, the vertical axis is percent of all employed people in the censuses. And you can see that in the 1980s, this orange line, which is the fraction of tasks being performed, of jobs being performed by people that, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, only require vocational skill, has been falling. But the fraction of workers in the economy in blue that have vocational education has been falling much faster, opening up a gap between those two things. And if you consider just natives in green, that gap is substantially larger. Now, in this graph, the shallowness of the decline of that orange line kind of shocks people sometimes. You know, the reports of the death of the vocationally skilled job are greatly exaggerated. There are some that are truly on the way out, and many that are not. And just to illustrate that, I want to introduce this distinction between fundamental and replaceable tasks. Economists have come up with objective measures of here in the columns, the offshore ability of different occupations, and in the rows, the routineness of the occupations, or in some sense, the automatability of the occupations. In the upper left-hand corner, this allows a classification of a set of vocationally skilled occupations that are difficult to offshore because they require face-to-face interaction, and difficult to automate because they are not routine. So we're talking about care workers, carpenters, chefs, hairdressers, and numerous others. And the trends for these fundamental workers relative to all the rest of them, which we lump together as replaceable workers, are really sharply different. Here, the vertical axis is employment of vocationally skilled workers per highly skilled worker. In white, this is for all vocationally skilled workers. That ratio has been falling. But for fundamental workers alone, it hasn't been. There's been one fundamental worker per highly skilled worker in the Australian economy for decades, with only a slight a downward trend. And it's the offshoreable, the automatable occupations that have been going away. There is a core that is not going away anytime soon. With these tools in place, it's easy to make a back of the envelope calculation. And this really is just a somewhat sophisticated back of the envelope calculation, starting from a scenario of growth in the Australian economy. Suppose that pre-pandemic levels of GDP growth were to continue for the next 30 years. That would imply, according to past relationships, a certain expansion of highly skilled employment. How much vocationally skilled employment would that mean? Well, without assuming the extremes of perfect substitutability or just fixing today's ratio of vocationally skilled employment to highly skilled employment, neither of which are realistic, we can assume a continuation of the trends of the disappearing vocationally skilled jobs relative to highly skilled jobs, which, as I say, is continuing, but there is a core that will remain. And from that, comparing to the supply of native vocationally skilled labor, estimate a skills gap. And this is the bottom line. Rising in absolute terms demand for vocationally skilled employment. This is the tasks with vocational skill content demanded by the Australian economy, 1 million more in any given year, 30 years into the future. The catch is that the number of Australian natives with the commensurate skill level, that is a vocational level education, is falling in absolute terms. And the gap between those two lines opens up to 2 million by the year 2050. Not much of this, as you can see, is due to demographic change, I want to point out. This is really this is really arises from the fundamentals of economic growth and doesn't really depend on a large shift in demographic change relative to rates of demographic change before the present. Notice there are only 3 ways to close this gap. One is less economic growth. Australians on average are just worse off. Another is downskilling. Natives who have higher levels of education simply do tasks that don't require the education that they have, that on average makes them worse off than they could have been if there were vocationally skilled workers to complement them, or vocationally skilled immigration. And this is the one thing that I hope to leave with all of you, is this idea that somehow a highly skilled immigrant is always and everywhere, in an economic sense, more desirable than a vocationally skilled immigrant, is based on an economic model that I don't know a labor economist who believes, which is that the 2 kinds of workers are perfect substitutes. They are not perfect substitutes. And indeed, when there is such a large and rising demand for vocational skill in the labor market, if there is created a high skilled job, that means there are going to be vocationally skilled jobs that are necessary for that job to happen. The surgeon cannot do work if the hospital is not being cleaned by someone. And without vocationally skilled immigration, that requires, the numbers point out, downskilling for natives. The trade-off is not native jobs versus immigrant jobs. The trade-off is either vocationally skilled employment or native downskilling. To close, I haven't mentioned the Pacific yet, and Satish is going to talk about the Pacific. Not surprising that the American has not mentioned the Pacific yet. But I do want to point out that the numbers are very clear, even to an American. There has been very little Pacific immigration to Australia. Here is the fraction of the labor force, and again, this is not by education level. This is by the skill content of tasks, regardless of the skill level. In the last 4 censuses, immigrants comprise about 30% of the workforce. Pacific immigrants comprise about 1%. So there's been extremely little, and the constraint is not supply. And this is what I want to close with. It is true that right now, across the Pacific Island Forum member countries, just below half of the labor force has a secondary education. But the region is projected to get much more educated over the next 30 years, and by 2050, a very large majority of the workforce of the Pacific will have vocational skill. You can in fact see that the increment in the vocationally skilled labor force of the Pacific is projected to be about 4 million in that time. That is to say, this entire skill gap in Australia could be filled just with half of the increment of people with the commensurate skills in the region. And we're not suggesting that that's economically optimal in any sense, but we're pointing out those numbers just to say that there is absolutely no supply constraint of the requisite skills in the region. What's missing is ways to realize this vast opportunity for mutual benefit, and that's what I'd like to turn to Satish for.
Satish, are you there? If you are, could you unmute yourself and share your screen?
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let me share my screen and yes. Okay. I'm sorry. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen at all? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Michael. That was quite helpful. What I will do is provide you a bit more granular information with regards to the vocational skills we're talking about Australian demand and the potential supply from the Pacific, and the policy lessons emanating from the work we have been doing. So just to begin with, I think in terms of vocational skills, Michael has already explained, we're using the Australian classification as provided by the ABS. I should do this one. Okay. So just in terms of looking at the data itself, if you're looking over the last 2 decades or 3 decades, if you like, beginning from 1995, in terms of where employment levels have been and the projections for the future, the 4 fastest growing areas are healthcare and social assistance, as shown by the graph in front of you, professional and scientific services, education and training, and accommodation and food services. So again, going back to what Michael was talking about, if you sort of drill down a bit more in terms of these 4, the 4 largest sectors where we expect growth in employment. In healthcare and social assistance, as you can see, we expect something like 250,000 jobs to be created by November 2025. So we're looking at a fairly short time horizon. Now, we could actually drill further down, looking just at those 4 industries, focusing on the skills that would be demanded. So if we focused specifically on the skills, I'm sorry. Okay, there we go. So if we just looked at the 4, or in this case, the 3 top sectors, healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and professional and scientific services, I hope you can see the red colored areas. So we're expecting growth in healthcare and social assistance of something like 14.2% or 249.5 thousand new jobs, as was shown earlier. Now, of that, childcare accounts for roughly 153,000 new jobs. I'm sorry, 14,200 new jobs, or a growth rate of 10.2%. So going back to what Michael was talking about earlier, these are not offshoreable jobs. I mean, if you are to have childcare, obviously you can't mechanize this, or not at least in the short term. You can't offshore this. So this is the sort of jobs we're talking about. The next highlighted one in terms of accommodation and food services are cafes, restaurants, takeaway foods, and so on. Again, the projections are to November 2025. So this is fairly short term, of 114,000 new jobs, so a growth rate of roughly 19.6%. So these are numbers published by the Australian government. And the last one is management and related consulting services. Again, these we think are not offshoreable. These are tasks that will be done onshore. Again, a growth of something like 14.2%. So the red bits, I'm not expecting you to look at each and every number. The red ones are those that we think are fundamental tasks, which will require people onshore. But most importantly, these are folks who will have skill levels, according to the ABS classifications, of anything around 3 or 2, largely 3, as you can see. So let's see what 3 really means. So again, if you're looking at the skill levels, skill level 1, according to the ABS classifications, is someone with a bachelor's degree or higher. Skill level 2 is advanced diploma or diploma. Skill level 3 is somebody with a certificate 4 or 3 plus at least 2 years of on-the-job training. Skill level 4 is those with just skill certificate level 2 or 3. And 5 obviously is those with Cert 1 or secondary education. So if you're looking at where or which skill level would have the most, the largest increase in demand, then that's skill level 4, which is these folks over here. These are people with Cert 2 or Cert 3. I was sort of pointed out yesterday by Richard, so thanks Richard for this, that, you know, the ABS classifications in terms of skills and those skills that would be in demand do not match exactly with the migration criteria for in terms of points to be earned to migrate. So we'll come back to that point in a minute. So we have sort of looked at demand. The supply, as we're saying, is from from the rest of the world. So let's have a look at where this is likely to come from. To begin with, I mean, this is an issue that Michael and I have been working on for a few years, at least before COVID came along. Excuse me. But COVID has exposed the labor shortages in Australia in a big way, in a really big way. So the discussions as of this year, beginning this year, and more so the last 24 hours, have been on the critical shortages for labor that would be important for economic recovery or post-pandemic economic recovery. Why focus on the Pacific? I think there is acknowledgement, or not, I think I'm quoting the Australian government sources saying that the seasonal worker program and the Pacific Labour Scheme provide direct and tangible economic benefits to both our Pacific family and Australian farmers in the industry. So this is a statement straight out of the government. Furthermore, the government is focused on getting the policies right to enable employers to recruit more Pacific workers to help meet both current and future workforce shortages, again, straight out of the government. There has, as was pointed out by Richard just before the session started, there has been discussions about a new agricultural visa, which will extend beyond the Pacific to the ASEAN in particular. There's also discussions following the US or Australia, UK FTA on looking at temporary work visas for British nationals. So again, the demand for workers, is being highlighted within the government circles. What we have argued is that if we were to look at the Pacific and if we were to focus on vocational skills, then obviously the Pacific provides the opportunity to put into practice Michael's idea of the Global Skills Partnership, which looks at investing in training or in upskilling of potential workers abroad, the Pacific, and think of the IPTC as a model, with the view to having them come, or having these people who are trained or upskilled abroad to come and work onshore, particularly for those tasks that cannot be offshored, with the view to enabling these workers not just to come and work in Australia or even in New Zealand, but to circulate throughout the region. And this is the subject of our second paper. Michael, have I missed anything that you still want to cover? Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you both for that really interesting presentation. It's been a while since I've seen perfect substitute and perfect complements graphs, so I particularly appreciated that, Michael. A reminder to all the attendees that you can post questions on the Q&A section, or you can raise your hand and we'll come to you. Given that I'm chairing, I might take privileges and I might ask Michael and Satish, obviously some of the debates over here, particularly around healthcare and social assistance, have touched on wages being an issue, like part of the reason why jobs in the healthcare and social assistance sphere and accommodation and retail and hospitality haven't been taken up by locals is because they pay really poorly. What would you say to that? What would be your comment on that?
Thank you. Satish, if you want to say something, let me know. But wages were conspicuously absent from this analysis. You saw this is analysis just of employment. And what I want to point out is what these figures imply is that the number of Australians with the education that is supplying in themselves the education that is commensurate to the jobs that you're talking about. For example, care work, carpentry, hairdressing, others of these fundamental jobs that are necessary to complement increases in high skill employment. The number of those Australians is not just falling in relative terms; it's falling in absolute terms. The number of people with the commensurate education is shrinking. So yes, it is always possible to invest greatly in the education of Australians and then provide employment to them that does not use their skills at a wage that is that is propped up by immigration barriers. It is possible to make labor scarcer with immigration barriers. However, that does not make Australia better off. Why? Because it's much better for Australians who have invested in skills to have work that is commensurate with those skills. The gains to working at a level commensurate with your associate degree or your bachelor's degree is much more than the gains that you would get from a protection-induced rise to your care work wage. So that I don't mean to. But both of those things can be true at the same time. But it would be possible to prop up the wages of care workers. That does not mean that is the policy that would be better for Australians. What would be better for Australians is to expand opportunities for Australians who have invested in skill, and they continue to massively invest in skills so that the number of people with vocational skills is shrinking in absolute terms. Expand opportunities for them to work together in partnership with Pacific Islanders who have vocational skills to the mutual benefit of both. There is I don't want to go on and on. Satish has something more useful to say than that.
No, I think the point that Michael is making, and I'll sort of summarize it for him. One is basically allocation of resources. So if we let wages jump, Gabriella, as you're suggesting, then all we're going to do is move workers from one area to the other. But that'll be at the expense of one, cost of living, but two, also to GDP. I think that's probably all that we want to say at this stage.
Just unmuting myself. Thank you both for that response. I might go to the Molonglo Theatre and just see if there are any questions in the audience there. Ari, if you've got roving mics or anything like that, are there any questions from the in-person audience? If not, I have a few as well, so I can keep going.
Could I just make an analogy, Gabriella?
Yeah, for sure, please do.
Well, there's just the issue that you raised just dominates the public policy debate about the economics of immigration. So it's really a hobby horse of mine. And two of the leading economists in the world, Daron Acemoglu and David Otter at MIT, have shown in a famous paper that the massive entry of women into the labor force in the United States after World War II caused a transitory fall in the wages of low-skilled men in America. So if you were to think, if you were to consider two policy proposals that would be better for Americans, and I mean men and women in the short term and the long term, and ask which one is better for them overall, one which is block as much as possible the entry of women into the labor force so that they don't cause that small depression of men's wages, thereby propping up the wages of some low-skilled men, or expanding opportunities for men and women to invest in skill and work together in ways that complement one another at all skill levels. I would opt for the latter. So it doesn't mean that there is no effect of immigrants on wages. What I'm talking about is that expanding opportunities for people of different skill levels to complement one another in the labor force. And that is what vocationally skilled workers do for high-skilled workers that are considered so desirable. It is to the long-term mutual benefit of everybody, and that benefit greatly exceeds the price effects that you can get from just keeping out as many vocationally skilled workers as possible and admitting only high-skilled workers. Now, Australia, thank goodness, doesn't do anything like that. Australia is light years beyond where the United States is. The United States literally has no work visa, with immaterial exceptions for people doing non-seasonal work that doesn't require a university degree. There is no care work visa. There is no carpenter visa. There is no dairy visa. It doesn't exist. So these people are treated as if they don't massively complement me and other people with university education like me in our efforts to create employment for high and low skilled workers across the economy. And it's just a major misconception. So think it's worth highlighting that that the fact of not considering wages in an employment-based analysis of this kind doesn't mean that that they aren't important. But we're talking about bigger issues than just the relatively small wage effects that have just absolutely dominated policy discussion of this kind.
Thank you. I have probably a double, I don't think there's any questions coming in from the in-person audience, but I probably have a double-barreled question for both Satish and Michael. So obviously we've heard some recent, and I'm sure we'll get to this through all the presentations, but we've heard some recent announcements about a prospective agricultural visa and that coming in, and interested in your thoughts on how far that might go towards achieving some of those goals in terms of vocationally skilled workers. And sorry, I'm just also noticing that we've got a question from online on the Q&A about why the supply for vocational workers in Australia is falling. So yeah.
Well, that great question is easy. So let me just address it quickly. The number of people the absolute number of Australians who take their education only to the secondary level and stop has been falling for years and is going to continue to fall. If that's a good thing, then that means there is going to be a shortage of people to do these tasks. You notice nowhere in the analysis did we say, well, a fourth policy option is to encourage people to not go to university. I don't think that's on the table in Australia or the United States or any other country that I know of. Try to make sure that there are more and more people who get only secondary education. So we have just ruled that out as a policy response. Yes, another policy response would be to encourage Australians to get less and less educated, so that their investments in skill are not wasted by employment that doesn't require it. But Satish and I are not on board with such a policy recommendation. Satish, do you want to talk about the agricultural work visa? You're muted, Satish.
Yeah.
Sorry. Look, on the agricultural visa, Gabriella, I think it's still in discussion, so it's probably a bit early to be talking about that. But on the shift away from vocational training in Australia, I thought the Australian society as a whole has been pushing very hard for a clever country. So upskilling, I think, is sort of extremely well embedded within the Australian psyche. But that doesn't mean that we will not require those people with vocational skills. So I think the chart that Michael showed earlier on in terms of the yawning gap between supply and demand would have to be filled from somewhere. I mean, if it wasn't done, then the way the market would clear is through what you were just suggesting earlier on, is in terms of increases in prices, but the flow and effects of that would be, higher costs and lower growth in GDP. We do talk a little bit about that in the paper.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. We've got a question from Mariam, and she's raised her hand, so I'm just going to allow her to talk because the question's quite long. Mariam, can you hear us? Are you?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk, Michael and Satish. Really enjoyed it, and good to see you as well. So my question was around how to make this work in Australia, because we've been having this discussion quite a bit, and I've done some work in the aged care sector as well here recently that really needs a lot of carers. And the type of labor we're talking about. But the issue, there are two things that I feel like are a problem making this work. And I wonder if you guys have thought about that, or how to help the policymakers make this happen in the sector. And that is, unlike the agriculture sector with the seasonal workers, we would need the seasonal workers in the care sector to actually stay in Australia a bit longer. the longer actually the better, because you need them to, to gain the experience here, and then they, and so on. So, a 9 months program and so on is not as helpful than something longer. And the other issue is that where those skills are needed are actually urban areas in Australia, not the rural areas like the agriculture sector. So urban areas in Australia are quite expensive to live. So we are looking at, settling people in a longer term basis in urban areas to be able to provide the care work. And I think from the point of the policy makers here in Australia, that these are the issues also to consider, and how, kind of how to bridge that gap kind of. Do you have suggestions? And yeah.
Great, thank you, Mariam. Michael, Satish, do you have an answer from that one?
Thank you so much. The short answer is in the analysis of the paper, we just lump all fundamental workers together, and we didn't separately consider care workers, which, as Satish pointed out, are such a and as you point out, are such a critical are going to be so critical to the entire Australian economy going forward. It's really a if you could take away one thing from the analysis that I put on the screen, it would be that this mismatch between supply of education and demand for vocationally skilled tasks is not seasonal. It's permanent. It's ongoing. For the purposes of all of us here on this short-lived planet, it's never going away. So a policy needs to be commensurate with that. The U.S., as I mentioned, has been living a fantasy that the only labor market gaps to be filled with by workers who don't have a bachelor's degree from a university are for seasonal work, ruling out the entire care sector and even parts of agriculture, as I mentioned. Poultry and dairy can't even use the ag work visa that we have because they're not deemed to be seasonal industries. That's really ludicrous. If that requires fundamental legal reforms to create visas that are apt for this kind of permanent, non-seasonal, never going away, only going to get bigger gap in the labor market, then new visas need to be created. My impression, and here I'm very ignorant of the details of the law, is that Australia is much more advanced than the U.S. And has been for decades in creating work visas that are accessible to people with vocational skill. They basically don't exist in the United States. Settler visas based on work without family sponsorship for people with vocational skill. There's never been a shortage occupation list in the United States that you can get points for to settle here. There isn't a green card to the United States that you can get based on to come directly from abroad based on vocational skill. It doesn't exist. So I'd really be interested in your assessment, Mariam, and Satish's assessment of whether the existing visa structure is capable of filling anything like this yawning 2 million person gap in the labor force over the next 30 years, or whether fundamental immigration law reforms would be required. Yeah, you know about that and I don't.
No, just quickly on that, I mean, there's some good news on this front in terms of the Pacific Labour Scheme, which gives visas for up to 3 years. You'd recall that the chart I was showing you were for those non-offshoreable tasks. So obviously, childcare is one of them, but so is aged care. But another big one emerging is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is supposed to create quite a few new jobs, which again are not going to be offshoreable. I think the issue over here is alignment of the ABS classification of skills with the immigration system, which then allows people to come out to work. I mean, at the moment, the threshold to get into Australia would be a skill level 3, which requires you to have a Cert 3 or a Cert 4, plus at least 2 years of work experience in an accredited institution or business. Now, more than likely, you won't have aged care, which would be accredited within the Pacific Islands to be able to provide you with the experience to enable you to migrate. So what we are suggesting is, and this is part of the Pacific Skills Visa, so this is our second paper, where we're saying that, you know, if we had this temporary mobility facility where people could acquire the academic qualifications, say at the APTC or the Fiji National University or whoever, with the view to coming across and gaining the work experience so as to be able to move not just to Australia, but internationally in providing those services, whereby the cost of the training would be paid for through the future income. So much like the HEX scheme, then it works to the benefit of everybody. So, but you know, this is an issue that we take up in the second paper.
Great, thank you.
That's about the Pacific Skills Visa.
Thanks so much. And we've actually had quite a few questions coming in about that paper, so, but sadly we're out of time. Thank you so much, Michael and Satish, for that.
Thank you.
Presentation and for taking questions. Our next presenter for today is Richard Curtin, and he'll be presenting on identifying the demand for middle skilled occupations in Fiji. Richard's a research fellow specializing in Pacific labour mobility, and has worked on labour mobility assignments in Fiji, PNG, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, and Tonga. Richard, over to you. If you could unmute yourself and share your screen, that would be great. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much, Gabriella. There we are. Is that okay?
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Well, I'll move through quickly on the presentation this morning. In fact, it's very much the opposite end of the perspective that we've just heard from Michael and Satish. It's looking in detail at survey data, large sample survey data available from Fiji, the Fiji Bureau of Statistics survey conducted by them at 2 different points in time, with a focus on the most recently available survey, to look much more closely at the middle skills that the vocationally trained job holders that Michael and Satish were talking about, to look at it in much more detail in terms of not only the numbers of people in those occupations in Fiji, but also their educational levels and vet qualifications, to get a much better understanding of the available demand for those occupations. So, as I said, the focus is on middle skill occupations, and this is a term that's used, for example, in the most recent OECD Employment Outlook, which has a whole chapter on middle skill occupations, if people want to look at how it's defined there. The particular focus of this presentation is on using educational qualifications, both 3 different pathways that I'll be focusing on, 2 educationally based pathways and 1 based on the apprenticeship system. The purpose of this research is to identify what the actual demand is for middle skill occupations, particularly trade-based occupations, which would be of importance to the Australia Pacific Training Coalition, the APTC, but also it's important to work out what the demand might be for migration into Australia with those qualifications. As I said, the data source that I'm referring to and using are 2 large surveys. These have only been at this scale have only been conducted in Fiji. They provide much more detail than a normal labour force survey that would be carried out in other Pacific countries. And the large size of the sample, particularly with such a large formal sector in Fiji, enables you to provide enough data to report on populations at what is called the 4-digit level, according to the International Standard Occupational Classification System, used as the basis for recording information on occupations in the Pacific and more widely around the world. And it does connect to the Australian Occupational Classification System, or there's a concordance that can move from one to the other. The value of this level of disaggregation is that it enables you to identify what jobs require, or how you connect that to specific vocational qualifications. And that's the particular benefit from a labour supply perspective. What I want to briefly outline is what I'll be looking at in the presentation, basically to discuss how Fiji's middle skill occupations are defined and recognised, then look at the existing skills stock based on the number of job holders in skills-based occupations and the educational profile of job holders, and then look specifically at two large occupations, middle skill occupations, carpenters, cooks, and chefs, to identify different educational levels and two types of skill demand that they serve. Now, the way that, as I pointed out just briefly at the beginning, that skills are defined, vocational skills are defined in Fiji, is that there are two educational pathways, or let me say that this is an international definition, and then I'll later in the paper refer to how it's applied in Fiji. But there are two broad educational pathways. The first stage of secondary education, which includes vocational and technical training, and the second educational pathway where upper secondary schooling is completed, which includes specialised vocational training qualification, which may include some on-the-job training. And the third is to obtain a post-secondary non-tertiary educational qualification based on a mix of formal and informal on-the-job training, often called an apprenticeship. So how are skills, middle-level skills, recognised in the labour market? It's important to acknowledge, of course, that it's the employer who decides whom to hire, but the employer's decision can be greatly influenced in terms of whether they require a vet qualification or not, by a number of factors. And these factors may include pressure from government regulations, such as an occupational licence, and in Fiji that applies to electricians and refrigeration and air conditioning technicians, or a national building code is another form of government regulation. But there also may be market expectations that are applied, for example, by prime contract specifications on large construction projects, or the requirements of a prime contractor for subcontractors. And there's also a pressure that's applied by occupationally based unions that very much emphasise a youth-based pathway with a junior wage as a means of acquiring skills in that occupations. Finally, an important way of the way middle skill occupations are defined is through the migration system. And as Satish pointed out, the difference between the way middle skill occupations are defined in the Australian ANSCO classification and the migration system is that the migration system requires 3 years work experience to define a middle level occupation as opposed to the 2 years in ANSCO. And that 3 years really refers to an apprenticeship type arrangement. Now, let me go on to the first table that outlines the data. In the paper itself, before I present this table, I go into a lot of detail about the 3 vet pathways that Fiji has, but I won't go into that detail because of time issues. I'll jump straight into the data that we have presented up. I've presented up on the screen, and as you can see there, the largest middle skill occupation by far is building carpenter, carpenter and joiner. On the far left side is the Fiji code, which is basically derives from the International Standard Occupational Classification System. The carpenters come in at some 11,000, and this number is very close to the number of carpenters identified in the 2010-11 employment and unemployment survey, which was 10,700 carpenters. So that consistency shows that over time, 2 different surveys are identifying a reality on the ground as this, through their large sample that reflects the actual numbers within a margin of error. The other key occupations are automotive mechanics at 4,000, some 4,200, then electricians down at 2,200. Chef is coming in at 2,000, but at the bottom of the table is cook, which cooks coming in at just under 1,000. And later on the analysis, I combine both of those occupations. You can see there that the classification for the chef is comes in a different category to cook. 5, 1, 2, 3, as opposed to, sorry, a cook is the same again, 5, 1, 2, 3, because they're classified as service occupations. The next table looks at the proportion of people who responded that they had a post-school qualification with vet training. And what's surprising is the low proportion in occupations where it could be very much expected that the occupants would have a vocational, a post-school vocational training. And here we see it for fitters and mechanics at 1/3, electricians just under 1/3, plumbers at 30%, welders 1/4, and auto mechanics 1 in 5. The implications from looking at these data, first of all, the implication is that the stock of the largest middle skill occupations over 2 time periods showed that the total number of formal and informal sector jobs for these occupations. So this data source is a valuable source of information about what the reality is on the ground, the actual numbers of people working in an occupational level that corresponds to a vet qualification. The education, the low level of education of job holders, and going back here, we can see the other feature of this table is to present information about the educational level. In the 4, 5 categories there, is up to Form 4, Form 4 and Form 5, certificate, school leaving, certificate, university entrance, and then a post-school certificate or diploma. So we see for carpenters, 43% of the profile have less than Form 4. Chef, though, we find 50% have a certificate or diploma, but on the other hand, cooks, only 8% have a certificate or diploma. However, the scope for skills upgrading by undertaking, for example, a APTC qualification is limited because many job incumbents will not have sufficient basic education to be accepted for a course at APTC or an internationally accredited course at the National University of Fiji. There may not be a strong desire by job incumbents to upgrade their skills, nor a strong employer demand for workers to have higher skill level for the job they're doing. Now, there is information from the Employment and Unemployment Survey in 2015-16 that throws light on the assessment of the job holder as to whether they think their educational qualification is adequate or not.
Sorry, Richard, just really quickly, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. So if you could
Okay.
give closing remarks, thank you.
All right. So basically, the final point that I'll make here is that many workers and employers may be locked into a low pay, low skill equilibrium. And that is shown through their responses to the educational qualifications that they've got for carpenters and for cooks and chefs. So the issue of the perceptions of the adequacy of their education level provide important additional information about the nature of demand for different skill levels in those two particular occupations. Many carpenters and cooks in Fiji appear to be locked into a low pay, low skill equilibrium, while a small number of job holders have the qualifications suited to higher paid work. The small size of the latter group means that the skills pool eligible for work visas in Australia and New Zealand is much smaller than the number of job holders in these occupations suggests. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Richard, and thanks for keeping to time as well. So we've got someone that's raised their hand. So Chris, if we can go to you, I'm just going to allow you to talk. If you'd like to just introduce yourself and ask a question, thank you. And unmute as well. Chris, are you there? If you could unmute. Okay, we might just give Chris a minute, but in the meantime, is there anyone in the audience who has a question for Richard? Can't quite see. Richard, I did have a question around some of those higher level qualifications that you saw for chefs. Is some of that is some of that partly because of migration intentions? So maybe they might want to migrate outside of the country, and so in order to do that, for their occupations to be recognised, they might need a higher level qualification. Could that be part of the reason why that's occurring?
Certainly, that has always been a strong motivation in Fiji for people to acquire qualifications that are likely to give them entry to work in Australia or New Zealand. But don't forget also that Fiji has a very substantial tourist sector with 4- and 5-star hotels, so that they have large employers who very much want to encourage their staff to acquire the qualifications that they think would be necessary to carry out their jobs. And APTC certainly had employers willing to provide staff working full-time to undertake training courses to upgrade their skills.
And that's mostly, is that work sponsored for them?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Well, we might, if there are no further questions, we might leave it there. Thank you so much, Richard, for that presentation. And I might throw to Molonglo Theatre, where I believe Ryan is our next presenter. So Ryan, as most of you know, is the Deputy Director of the Development Policy Centre, and he'll be presenting on vocational qualifications, supply, demand and returns, the case of the the Australia Pacific Training Coalition. Ryan, over to you. Also, could Newcast Studios please unmute as well so the rest of us can hear? Thank you. Ryan, sorry to interrupt. Could you unmute the mic if possible? Sorry, on the system. I think it's on Zoom.
There we go.
Great,
Yep.
we can hear you now. Thank you.
That better? Well, those first comments were mostly for those here, but thank you to everyone else joining us at home on Zoom as well. Today I'm going to be presenting quite a simple paper. It's work in progress and quite preliminary, so we'll be really grateful to receive your feedback on it. The title for now is Vocational Qualification Supply, Demand and Returns. And it's a case study of the Australia Pacific Training Coalition, which I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. It started as a master's research essay project from one of our fantastic students here at the Crawford School, Tunya, who is back there with us in the room, and we're now expanding it and developing it a little bit further. And it builds on some work done by Richard and Stephen in the last few years as well, using the exact same data as well. So I can't move the slides. The slides aren't moving. Some slides. Yeah, so now we can move. So I had a slight technical issue with the slides. So the motivation for this paper, like a lot of what we've been discussing so far, is this idea of skill shortages. So-called skill shortages. I'm going to use use some scare quotes around this term because it's quite a problematic concept. It's often subject to quite a lot of debate. But this kind of accepted definition of it is normally where the demand for a particular type of work exceeds their supply in the market. But of course, the reason this is a bit problematic is that it's quite hard to observe, quite hard to measure. And both of these things, the demand and supply, are quite dynamic and people respond to markets. So one potential solution to these type of skill shortages is quite a highly interventionist response. We could just increase the supply. So the common response usually whenever these skills are at the sort of vocational or TVET type level is increasing the supply through the TVET system by sort of playing the central planner role and trying to figure out which skills are needed and then injecting them into the economy. And so this paper is trying to shine a little bit of light on the question of, is this a particularly good response? How does this work? What's the demand like in this case study? What are the returns like? How is this really functioning? And some of the main issues that make this a sort of challenging question is that most of the shortages in labour markets do tend to be dealt with through the normal operation of labour markets, be that through varying wages, varying conditions, but then workers' own skill acquisition and responding to them, as we often see in areas like tech or mining or wherever in Australia. And it's quite difficult for a policymaker and a planner to actually figure out where these sectors are both today, but then also in the future, because skill investment is a dynamic process over time. So this paper examines graduate employment outcomes from a very large, in relative terms, supply side TVET intervention in the Pacific, APTC. And then we start asking at the end whether actually having these TVET qualifications leads you as the qualification holder to be better off in the long run. So what we do in a bit more detail, we use APTC's own data, so they have graduate tracer surveys that they've been doing since program inception, to try and empirically characterize both the trends and the patterns in employment outcomes. I said it's quite a simple paper. It's not quite descriptive, but we're going to use some regression and statistical techniques to try and hold a few things constant and unpack where these differences in placement are really coming from. And then at the end, this is really the work in progress at the moment. We use the national survey data, so the household income and expenditure surveys from some Pacific countries, to then ask a simple question over whether, if you actually hold a certificate, what are your earnings like relative to people who have different levels of educational attainment, be that grade 10, grade 12, or university? Where do you sort of sit on the earning spectrum? So I'm going to give you a quick preview of the findings in case you fall asleep or want to leave early, as we often do in economic seminars. So the first one is that, similar to some of the work that's been done earlier, we do find that employment outcomes for APTC graduates do tend to be worsening over time with the increasing supply of these graduates and with the changing composition of the qualifications being offered. This suggests in turn that the demand is indeed somewhat weak in the countries, because most of the graduates are placing into their domestic markets, not just domestic, Pacific at large, but in their home countries. And we do see a lot of heterogeneity. So the different qualifications do lead to very different employment outcomes in terms of their paid jobs, which actually suggests that even across the specific ones being offered, there's quite limited matching taking place between deciding what's in need and then what's being taken up. And we see this particularly between the shift between stage 1 qualifications, which is those that are more sort of standard TVET quals, to the stage 2 ones, which have been offered more recently. We also find interesting differences across gender and across age groups. So younger graduates tend to be doing a bit better than older ones, and women tend to do worse. And there's quite a bit of differences across countries. Samoa has the best placement record, and Fiji does not appear to be doing too well, at least once we account for other factors in the statistical analysis. And then the final bit, whenever we look into the household survey data, is that we find that these technical certificate holders, on average, learn less and around that of someone who has completed grade 12 in a lot of cases. So between grade 10 and grade 12, they're not actually getting much more in the labour market. And this pattern appears to hold across several Pacific countries at the moment, but we're trying to expand it a few more just to see how strong that pattern is at the moment. That's a work in progress. So the rest of this talk, the outline, I'm just going to talk for a few seconds about what APTC is for those who are not familiar with it, talk about the data and then the method, and then give you some results on the employment outcomes. A lot of graphs, not too many regression tables for those of you who have been to econ seminars before. And then I'll present some results on these returns, at least from the P&G data, just to start. So what is APTC? Well, it's Australia's flagship TVET investment in the region. It was kicked off around 2007, and it's obviously pre-tertiary and pre-university level. Its main goal is to produce a more skilled, inclusive, and productive workforce, which enhances Pacific prosperity. This last one, this sort of broader economic development angle, is why I want to introduce this last part of the analysis into it, to try and ask, well, else equal, if you're not getting a job this year, or maybe even next year, are you still going to be better off with this qualification, or maybe not? And then the end of program outcome of APTC is that graduates have improved employment outcomes. So we're going to look at and talk about employment outcomes, but we can't actually answer this counterfactual question here without knowing what a similar person who had applied for APTC who didn't get it would have done absent it. It could just be that there's low demand in these labour markets. And you may actually be better off with the college, but we can't tell that. We can only look at the placement records of those who are in the program, not the person who could have got the degree but didn't. So that's actually a question we can't answer, and there isn't available data to answer. So since 2007, there's been around 12,000 qualifications. By 2018, probably more by now, 43 different types, and it's across 9 countries. So this is quite a large program in relative terms, in terms of the supply side injection. And I think it's a particularly interesting case study for thinking about these type of interventions, because we know that in most of these countries, domestic labour demand is quite weak. There's not that much in terms of formal employment opportunities, and migration opportunities are a really, really important feature of this discussion as a result. And so how this all fits together is, I think, quite interesting. So the data. The data, as I mentioned at the start, are APTC's own data. They're collected every year from people who graduated around 6 months prior to the survey. And it gathers feedback from them on their employment status, their qualifications, countries of origin, and a few other factors. They have changed a little bit over the years, but we can sort of attenuate that problem a little bit with some of the techniques that we use here. Annually since 2009 and collected via different methods. We don't have information on which one was collected via which method, but it was done by a diverse range of methods from online to phone to postal, you name it. The main issue and limitation of the data is a problematically low response rate, which we're very upfront about. That limits just how much we can learn in this regard. So most of the time, it's normally around 50%. It jumped up in 2017, but normally it's around half of graduates. But at the same time, since there are so many graduates, we're not dealing with a small sample here. We have got enough that we can play around a little bit and see how everyone's sort of doing. So what we then do, so because they sometimes change a little bit over the years, we do have to harmonize the survey responses across all the years and then merge the data together to be able to get this sort of repeat cross-section of all the graduates. And then we classify them into different industry sectors and the qualifications. So there's a lot of cleaning and work that went into this. Thank you, Richard, online. And we're going to focus, similar to how Richard and Stephen did, on non-affiliated graduates. Affiliated graduates are those who, like me, I might already have a job, I'll go undertake some training, then I go back to the job that I had. That's not a really helpful way of thinking about placement outcomes because you're not actually looking for it. You've already got the job. What we want to know is whether if you don't have a job and you go and get a skill, you're going to be able to go find a new job, whether there's actual demand for that skill in the market as a job seeker. So we think this is a much better indicator of both the skills, the quality, the demands, and obviously the placement record. Okay, not much time left. Thanks, Harry. So a few descriptive statistics I just want to mention. The first one is just simply that this affiliated share has been declining over time, and the non-affiliated share has been rising. So this is just how the data is set up that we're using. So we're only focusing on the blue graduates and using them over all the years. And another thing I wanted to mention was that there's just quite big differences across countries. So the right-hand side is the number of respondents in these surveys. And as you see, the axis sort of doubles depending on what you're looking at sometimes in the number. And the response rates largest in 2016 and then sort of rising over time as more are produced. But in terms of the outcomes that people go, there's quite a bit of volatility. So like look at Solomon's or some others, they're jumping around quite a bit in the placement rates. So this is whether people have a full-time job, although we've plotted all three there. And as you see, the part-time share is much, much, much smaller. So it doesn't really affect much whenever we lump them together as just being in a job period. So the boring part, the statistical analysis, this is just quite simple. This is the equation that I'm going to estimate. The outcome is simply an indicator of whether you have a job or not, whether you're in paid work, so full-time employment, or not in paid work. And just as a simple robustness check, we've done employment periods, so putting part-timers in with those that are in employment as well. Then the qualifications can be grouped into the first stage, which are these traditional TVET qualifications, and those more sort of business-oriented ones, which have come later as part of stage 2. So we've got this indicator that's a 0 or 1 if you're stage 1, and then we've got an indicator for the year at which you took the survey, not necessarily the year you graduated, but the year you took the survey. And then a whole bunch of other indicators for the country that you're from, your gender, your age, things like that. And then on interpreting the findings, so if this stage 1 variable is equal to 1, that just means that you're on average, whatever the coefficient we pull out, percentage points more likely to be employed than other graduates holding all these other characteristics constant. And this holding these other things is kind of important, constant, because then we can compare within countries within the same year cell, within countries within the same year and qualification sector cell, so things like that we can do. So the first main finding, I guess, is that similar to some of the earlier work that was done, we do find that those with stage 1 qualifications have much better placement records, as much as almost 20%, so around 18. And that's pretty stable no matter what we do, whether we control for country, the sector as well. This is quite stable. So that's sort of the main thing. That doesn't change whether we look at part-timers, those with no work, look at it in different year intervals, things like this. The second finding that comes out of this one should be that the year one. So this year is just a trend. This is telling us what happens with each passing year of the program. So with each passing year of the program, you're almost 3% less likely to get a job upon graduating once we account for the degree that you're holding, not the degree, but the certificate and the country you're from and these other things. The first one doesn't account for this, then the last one does. And I'm almost out of time, so I need to speed up a bit. You let me go a little bit over. I hope. And then this is just showing the same thing on the time trend, but doing it year by year. So it's a little bit noisy, but as you see in the earlier years, you are more likely, and then it comes and fades and hovers around 0 in the more recent years. And this is partly due to the shift in stage 1 and stage 2, and both the increase in the quantum over time. So stage 1 placements, typically up around 80%, doing quite well and slowly declining over time. And again, this is the same setup with this number of respondents. But then stage 2 placements, if you look at the left-hand side axis, it's about 20 percentage points lower. So they're doing much slower, but they're also increasing over time quite fast. That's what the yellow blocks are, the yellow bar. So it's largely a compositional story in what's being offered. Across sectors, we see some quite interesting differences. In particular, healthcare and social assistance do particularly poorly, which is quite interesting given what we've just seen from Michael and Satish, in that that's really where a lot of the demand in the migration opportunities is going to sit. So this is where we should be expanding migration opportunities in this program quite a lot. The other ones, you don't see such huge differences, and these are not quite precise. So the bands are 95% confidence intervals, and then the points are the estimates that we get. And this is controlling for the country that you're from and the year as well, because we know there's quite big year-on-year and country differences. If we split that up even more, you probably can't read that, but we can do it by every single qualification. It gets a lot noisier, but then the same sort of patterns do emerge even at a subsector level for the specific quals. The gender result, I think, is quite interesting and concerning. So just not accounting for these other factors, you're about 30 percentage points less likely to get a job if you're a female graduate. Once we start accounting for the qualifications that you're holding, the country and the local labour market that you're placing into and all these other things, that difference starts to go away, which you'd expect. I do need to wrap up. And for age, we do find placements are generally better for 25 to 44-year-olds, which are most of them, to be fair. So the older ones are not doing that well. Country does matter a little bit here. So this is just the country-specific effects and the plots by country. So for no paid work, you want to be on the left-hand side. And for this one, you want to be on the right-hand side. So as I mentioned before, yeah, so other way around actually. So yeah, some of those doing quite well, and then those are over here with the red ones not so well. So there's quite big country differences. And then, yeah, to wrap up, I wanted to talk just really briefly about the potential return. So this is the direction that we're trying to push now with the paper. So if many of these graduates are not currently getting jobs upon graduation, should they still expect to be much better off in the long run? And then should we see big welfare impacts from this program or not? So the question to then ask is, what does the average person holding a vocational certificate at the same time and at the same level of an ABCT graduate earn and consume back home? We shouldn't expect an ABCT graduate to earn much more than someone else with the same qual in the local labour market because they're competing for the same jobs, right? Then you're not going to really adjust that. That's not how markets work. And these questions are pretty crucial for thinking about whether just increasing the supply of these qualifications is really going to increase the well-being of graduates and go back to that broader program goal of contributing to prosperity. So we can look at income expenditures using these highest data that I mentioned, and we have preliminary results for PNG, Kiribati, and Tonga. The highest data are quite hard to access. They're not publicly available. They're not posted. That should really change. If anyone in the room has power to do that, please do so. But here's what it looks like for PNG. And I know I wouldn't have time to do all three today, but so this is just going up in terms of the qualifications. So the green line is grade 10 and earnings in Kino. Grade 12 next, and then dropping down to trade certificates and other certificates and diplomas. And you see there around or below what you get with grade 12. This is, I'm not doing any adjustments for age and other things like this. This is just the raw data, but we do see a similar pattern if we were to plug it into a regression. And then the big jump is really from bachelor's and then onwards to master's. But there's a big jump from grade 10 to grade 12. And I think that's quite interesting. I thought that it would be from grade 12 onwards to certificate that there would be quite a boost. So that's the end. No, sorry. Cool. And with that, I'll wrap up because I know I'm well over. I've told you what we did. I've told you what we found. And I think the main implications here, I guess, is I'm now a little bit skeptical of the notion of skill shortages in the region, or at least our ability to be able to match them as a planner. It needs to be much more sort of demand-based. And with that, for those that are in surplus at the moment, we need to be doing much better on labour mobility and aligning this with the migration opportunities here. And in terms of education provision, yeah, it seems like it would be good to focus on basic education again, where the returns may actually be higher.
Great.
What's next?
so much, Ryan. Any questions in the audience? Oh, quite a few. Oh, and mine.
What's in the chat?
We've got a couple of questions online as well. So a reminder to keep your questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. My name is Salotyan. I'm from the Fiji High Commission. I have a question specifically on the decline in employment for graduates. Could it be that people are being trained for a job market that doesn't exist? I look at Fiji and I see aged care and childcare. This basically doesn't exist as a job market. Children in Fiji and across the Pacific, there's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's essentially how children are raised. So for childcare, this is essentially a non-existent market in the Pacific. And in terms of how the sectors or how the 43 different types of qualifications are being determined and prioritized for funding, I see that APTC has been around since 2007. Why does it still exist today? Why is this not ingrained in our national institutions, organizations, and training facilities? How come APTC still exists? It's supposed to be working itself out of a job if it's supposed to be putting funding into a place that should be building capacity. And it also needs to reflect the demands on the ground in Fiji. Or are we training for the Australian job market? Because your visa systems and your migration protocols does not support that. So you're funding the upskilling of Pacific people for a job market that doesn't exist, that does exist in Australia, but then your migration processes don't support that. So you're coming into the Pacific, you're building capacity, funding it for over 10 years, but then it's not working. And the stats say that. So who's informing this continued funding and for whom?
No, thank you. 100% agree with the first part that you said about the domestic labour market. And as a few of my colleagues who I'm not going to name, but I'm going to look at often say to me, you've just gone and told us with statistics what we already knew from the field. Go and tell us. So yeah, I 100% agree with that. In terms of why does it still exist? I will refrain from answering that question. But I think that part of the initial need and motivation and the opportunity for them going forward absolutely is aligning them with the schemes and with the migration schemes. So there's no reason that we shouldn't be capturing that return, like quote, return on investment in ABC by basically plugging them into the demand that is here, because it is going to be hard to migrate with the domestic qualifications. And these ones are designed to be dual recognized. So if it's not for that, what else are they for? Right? Because you're not going to get a premium in the domestic market, like you said, which doesn't really exist. But no, 100% agree. And thank you, that's really helpful and thoughtful.
Michael, did you want to ask a question? I'm trying to do both online and in person, trying to split the load a little bit.
Thank you. Just very briefly, I didn't hear the name of the lady who just brilliantly spoke. I thought that was a very compelling intervention. I want to point out, and I'm sure Ryan knows this, that the original cost-benefit analysis in the documents of AusAid posited a 50% migration rate for APTC graduates, 50, as in half of them would be working in Australia or New Zealand, and obviously the reality is nothing like that. And it's an incredible institution that's achieved many things, but either overcoming that barrier to train to indeed train for a Pacific-wide labor market that includes a substantial portion in Australia or New Zealand, or focusing much more on the domestic labor market, if that possibility is never going to come about, is really compelling. Very briefly, a technical thing, Ryan. Don't be apologetic about the response rate in the survey. Just put in a dummy variable for the year of the survey interacted with whatever your variable of interest is, like the stage 1 variable. That will let the regression say if the answer depends on which survey round it comes from, the one with a 90% response rate or a 50% response rate. And I'll bet it won't make any difference. So then you just don't need to apologize for that.
Great. Might throw it back to the in-person audience to see if they have any other questions as well.
Thank you and good morning to everyone. My name is Samson, High Commissioner of Vanuatu. I've had few little questions when I saw your presentation, and thank you very much for putting out that presentation out there. First of all, I wanted to know the age range for your studies. What range of age actually you're doing the studies about, and also the locations within the country. Is it more urban, or you've been out to the rural areas as well to conduct your studies, and so that we can define exactly when you say no paid job, are these in the rural areas or mainly in the urban areas with an APTC qualification? For Vanuatu, I think the conditions and eligibility to be admitted to APTC means that you have to have a job previously. You have to have a job experience before getting into APTC. You can't just get in as here in Australia where you can just, anybody can just get into TAFE. And I understand that APTC is teaching TAFE Queensland across the Pacific. I look at the fluctuation as well in terms of your statistics. And one of the question when, no job or having a job, do you take into account the environmental stochasticities in there as well, such as cyclones or tsunami or anything that can happen in the Pacific, which can then translate into the fact that the workers might not have a job? I also want to allude my comments also to what the Fiji High Commission representative was mentioning about, training people for a market that is non-existent in the Pacific. In Vanuatu, we've always said, and you all know the history of Vanuatu, we've been colonized by two superpowers, that's Britain and France. And we've always made fun of it that when they left us with a machine that no one knows how to use it, because we didn't have the user manual to use the machine. So again, it looks like we're heading to that path again, where you're training us for jobs that do not exist in our country. And so the question now would be with APTC in terms of conditions of admission to APTC itself, and how if you have actually looked into how APTC could actually misplace our local institutions, the technical institutions, but also higher institutions, higher education institutions that could already provide the same trainings in the country. And how do we ensure that the long term and the sustainability of APTC actually in our countries vis-a-vis our local institutions that might already offer the same training as that. And some of our countries, and I'm thinking about, most of these countries in the Pacific have offered higher education in terms of their technical institutions because of their job market, where it is well aligned with their job market and everything. And just on APTC, Vanuatu has signed recently, and I'm quite surprised to see that APTC and Vanuatu, our Ministry of Education, have signed just this year, not long ago, 2 weeks ago, I think, or 3 weeks ago, it's in the paper, an MOU. And I understand that APTC existed already for over a decade already in Vanuatu. And it is a bit strange to see that they've just now signed these partnership MOUs when all along you would think that this would come already into picture. Thank you very much.
I've got a mic, I don't need paper. Thank you, High Commissioner. There's a lot there, there's 5 points. So most of yours, I think, are going to be very helpful for both the audience and for myself in thinking through stuff going forward. So I won't comment on everything just to keep the other questions moving. But age range, good question. I mentioned that the youth between 25 and 44 tend to be doing better. That is the biggest cohort, but it's quite a diverse spread. There are some older graduates, some slightly younger ones as well. I don't have those numbers handy. That's in the paper. The location of respondents, I'm wondering if Richard can answer that, but I don't have them handy. My initial my thoughts and the best of my memory is telling me was that a lot of them are coming from main islands and the big cities. I'm not sure how many are rural, but I would need to look into that further. The prior condition of having a job is definitely an issue. As I mentioned, that share has been declining over time as it's been opened up a little bit. But that's something that we're dealing with a little bit more based on the recent discussions on the blog as well. The environmental factors, that's one that I can talk with a bit more certainty to. The year effects do largely take care of that and the country effects. So by accounting for them, a lot of the shocks, particularly natural disasters, they hit one country at a time, right? And in 1 year at a time, usually. Or we might come across a few, but the general patterns, at least by having a multi-country analysis, does address country and year specific stuff whenever we're looking at a general factor like one like gender or like the stage 1 or those things. It does account for all those type of shocks quite nicely. That's one benefit of it. And your last one about the comments from the Fiji High Commissioner and the training for jobs that are not there, that was all really helpful. And I hope that those suggestions and concerns are taken on board. Yeah, I don't have much else to add to what you said there, apart from I agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for, sadly. But please join me in thanking all of our speakers for sharing their expertise and spending their morning, and in Michael's case, his evening with us. Thank you to all of you. And thank you also, thank you also to the audience, both online and in person, for your attention and also for all of your fantastic questions. Also, a final thank you to the Development Policy Centre for hosting this session, and to Ryan and the team for inviting us to present and to chair. And also special mention and thanks to Ari for his immense effort in organising a hybrid event like this, which obviously is not easy and it's gone off without a hitch. So thank you so much, Ari. With that, we might bring the proceedings to a close. Thank you all, and looking forward to viewing the next session. Thank you.